Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the UK has officially entered into its deepest recession on record. GDP fell by 20.4% in the second quarter, followed by a 2.2% fall in Q1. I'll be speaking with senior research analyst Lukman Otunuga about the impact on the British pound, and later I'll be talking with David Smith, the chairman of the British African Business Alliance, about the potential economic opportunities for entrepreneurs in the diaspora. And following last week's devastating explosion, Lebanon's government is on the brink of collapse. Hisham Safiuddin, an assistant professor from King's College, University of London, will be joining me from southern Lebanon with an update on what's happening on the ground. Then later, I'll be joined by Derek Mugisha from Uganda. He's the founder and CEO of the Fika Africa Advocacy Foundation, calling on Africa to do more about climate change following the devastating fires in Kenya's Tsavo National Park. But before those discussions, here's our business correspondent Simon Pusey with a breakdown of the biggest business stories trending in Britain this week. Simon, my goodness, where do we start? We've had some pretty abysmal numbers out of the UK this week. I'm going to be talking about GDP with a couple of my guests later on. Let's start with these pretty appalling unemployment figures.
Yeah, I don't think it was a shock to anyone that the figures are bad, but I think a lot of people didn't expect it to be this bad. Official figures released this week showing the number of people in work fell by 220,000 between April and June. The opposition party, Labour, are calling it Johnson's jobs crisis. They say that a downturn was inevitable because of the crisis, because of COVID-19, but that this is on Boris Johnson's head. The fact that the UK economy is doing so badly compared to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world is to do with the government. But in an interview this week, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, said that he wasn't going to go back on what he said was important to end the furlough scheme at the end of October. He said he wouldn't be doing that, and he said that doing that would be wrong and would be unsustainable. So let's have a little listen to what more he had to say.
My heart goes out to everybody who faces the prospect of losing their jobs, and with sectors, you talk about travel in particular, and most people in the airline industry think the recovery won't happen for at least 3 or 4 years. Now, I don't think it would be tenable to provide support over that period of time, but what we do want to do through our plan for jobs is give people new opportunities and fresh hope at what is unquestionably going to be a difficult time for many, and that's why some of our initiatives like improving the incentive for businesses to take on new apprentices, both under 25 and over 25, new traineeships, support for new training, all of these kinds of things make sure that people will have fresh opportunities to go to in the coming months ahead.
So trading performances seem to be varying depending on where in the country they are. So some rural businesses are actually doing better, and more people are in work in rural areas than in the cities. In the cities, people not going to work, staying at home, has really affected a lot of trading in terms of the big businesses, the big restaurant chains, etc. Some things have been introduced that should help recently. For example, Eat Out to Help Out, where this month in August, people are getting half the £10 off, up to £10 off their meal allowance. So that should help restaurant trade especially. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is saying the UK has performed worse as a result of it being focused on services like hospitality, consumer spending. Eyebrows raised over the opposition benches there, saying that that's not true. But that Eat Out to Help Out, other schemes should help. But those figures, really, really terrible. 220,000 people, less people in work between April and June this year.
Gosh, those hopes of a V-shaped recovery are fading, aren't they? Simon Pusey, thank you. The biggest economic story out of Britain this week is the GDP figures. The British economy shrank by 20.4% in the 3 months to June. The country has now entered into the deepest recession on record, one of the worst out of all G7 nations. Let's hear from Lukman Otunuga now, a senior research analyst at FXTM, about reactions on the foreign exchange market. Lukman Otunuga, always great to have you on the show. The recession has been confirmed. Please tell me what's been the latest on the foreign exchange markets.
Thank you for having me here today. Surprisingly, the British pound has actually offered a muted reaction across the G10 space, despite the UK experiencing its worst economic recession on record, and it's the worst growth seen in Western Europe. Now, the reason behind this is the fact that this could have already been priced in, with now investors evaluating whether the UK could bounce back or how fast the UK could bounce back. Expect the pound to become extremely sensitive to economic data over the next few weeks.
We spoke last week on the show, didn't we? This was just after the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee wrapped their meeting. They did say that perhaps negative interest rates could be on the way. Not really a big fan of that, Andrew Bailey is. Do you think we could potentially see that before the end of the year?
I do not believe the central bank is going to enforce negative interest rates anytime soon. We have to keep in mind that looking at those horrible GDP figures for the second quarter, this was the height of the lockdown restrictions and before the positive impacts of fiscal and monetary policies were reflected across the economy. I believe the Bank of England is going to cut interest rates to zero before the end of 2020 and possibly extend quantitative easing towards 2021. If economic conditions fail to improve, don't be surprised if the Bank of England actually decides to expand the quantitative easing beyond that 100 billion mark.
Well, I'll hold your words to that. Lukman Otanuga, Senior Research Analyst at FXTM, thank you so much. We'll hear more reactions from those striking numbers later in the programme. To other news now, and earlier this week, Lebanon's government resigned after the deadly explosion in a Beirut port. Current ministers are set to assume a caretaker role, but a push is underway for more than a third of sitting MPs to quit Parliament, which would force new parliamentary elections. The death toll from the blasts has risen to above 200, with up to 6,000 more wounded. Security forces have fired tear gas at protesters who neared Beirut's Parliament Square, where large numbers of soldiers and police have remained behind iron gates and barricades. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Hisham Safiuddin, an assistant professor from King's College, University of London. He's in South Lebanon. Hisham Safiuddin, thank you so much for once again joining me on Channel's Business Global. What a fast turnaround. A couple of weeks ago, it was bad. It wasn't this bad. This week, we've had a mass resignation from the government, but it's going to take much more than this, isn't it, to see Lebanon's hopes turning round again?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody expected the port to blow up. We literally had one of the, if not the biggest explosion that the capital city had witnessed. The port itself was the main artery for bringing in imports, which constitute a major source of welfare to the people. And also we had deaths, over 200 people died. We have massive destruction across the city, and there's very little money to build back what was destroyed. Also, the political class we talked about last time has completely lost any remaining legitimacy. The fig leaf has dropped, and we had this resignation. The question is what's going to happen next? And people are talking about the possibility of an early election. This is a proposal that certain factions were demanding. There's another option, which is to create a national unity government or a government of national salvation. But in both cases, it's the same people who are going to come back to the table. And honestly, I don't expect any easy solutions. There is now international intervention. France is leading the effort to create a new government, but they're still depending on the same political class that has failed so far to turn things around. So we're here in a really serious political quagmire. And if the same people come back to power, I really doubt they're going to be able to solve things. The difference is that there's going to be more meddling by the United States, by France, and possibly by other countries.
God, we've seen this story time and time again, not just in Lebanon or the region, but in many places across the world. Here in Britain, we've seen some really horrific pictures. It's interesting, and it's one of the double-edged swords about social media. You can put a hashtag out, but when you hear the stories of just how so many lives, thousands of lives have been affected, it's truly horrifying. There have also been some pretty shocking scenes with angry protesters. You can really feel the frustration. There are some commentators that are suggesting this is the most dangerous period in Lebanon's history. Could you put that into some context for us?
Well, this is definitely one of the most dangerous periods. Lebanon itself was created in 1920. Ironically, this is the centenary of Lebanon. And at the time, it was created against the will of the majority of its people who wanted to be a part of Syria. And since then, we had a sectarian setup that's always, every few generations or a couple of generations, has faced a crisis. So we've had a small civil war in 1958. Then we've had a major civil war in 1975 until 1990. And then since the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri in 2005 until today, we've also had unstable government, and we've also had continuous occupation by Israel. So today's crisis is multiple, this is the first time that we have a large-scale financial crisis coupled with a crisis of political rule. And the context today is different in the sense that the entire region, as you stated, is facing social fragmentation and upheaval, civil wars. So having international consensus, this is my point, around Lebanon is going to be difficult, unlike other instances, which means that we need unity among the people and unity among those leading the protests. And this is also still lacking. The word used most commonly lately is revenge. A lot of people are calling for revenge, but really we don't have a unified political opposition, a movement that can be trusted, and people are still acting individually. They're still going to the streets. I think demonstrating at this point is not necessarily the most efficient way of implementing change. There needs to be the creation of a national front by people who are visible to the population that can adopt the demands and create leadership that is willing and capable of taking on the task of rebuilding the country. So this is why today none of this is taking place so far. And the push is again to create a national government. And France, by the way, who's leading the government, President Macron, which came to he arrived in Lebanon, and his presence was very much a performance among the people. The more significant picture is what happened when he met with all the leaders. Macron and France itself was the patron of the debt that Lebanon was saddled with. Most of the conferences held since the 1990s until today to renegotiate the sovereign debt was actually sponsored by France. So you can't have the same governments that have been supporting these elites all of a sudden create an alternative political movement.
Thank you so much, Hisham, for bringing in Emmanuel Macron. We all saw the pictures of him at ground zero, got a little bit testy at times, but there have been some international press that have described it as a ridicule, really. I think Turkey in particular said it was a sham show. Do you agree with that? Do you think, unfortunately, or just how it is, France are kind of riddled with this colonial history that they just can't shake?
That's part of the culture of colonialism that still exists among certain sections as well of the Lebanese population. There is still an affinity within certain groups of people within Lebanon who harken back to the colonial times. But we have to put this statement by Erdogan and Macron's presence within the geopolitical war taking place, because France now is at odds with Turkey in relation to Libya. Let's keep that in mind. And France is also at little odds with the United States over Libya. So Lebanon is just another front in which the French, the Turks, and the United States are trying to make gains against each other. So we have to think of those statements. So they're all trying to discredit themselves, and each president is trying to gain some foot in Lebanon in order to improve their negotiating position towards other files in the region, whether it be Syria or, in this case, of course, Libya.
Absolutely. Hisham, we're running out of time, but before you go, I want to bring it back to the economics. There have been talks, of course, the bailout is going to be put on hold, talks of this bailout. Do you think ushering in a new administration, or, it's going to be the same old new administration, will that help?
I think anyone who's interested in knowing the future of the financial situation should focus less on forming a national government and more on the restructuring that will or will not happen to the banking sector. So even the IMF, following the International Donors Conference that was held over the weekend, clearly called for capital controls and for restructuring the banking sector. So eyes should be on whether any government that comes in is able to do those two things. This government already expressed its intention. This resigned government expressed the intention. It's just that the interests of the bankers are so entrenched that they are refusing to bear part of the cost. So people should ask whether the banking lobby in Lebanon is willing to accept some major part of the cost. And I doubt that any government today, unless it is from outside of this political class that is embroiled on corruption with the banking class, is able to do it. We'll see if the international forces are able to implement such an outcome. But the eyes should be less on the question of national government and whether there is a serious will to restructure the banking sector and the central bank. Those are the key indicators that people should look at.
Hisham Safiuddin, such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you once again. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, more reactions on the UK Q2 GDP figures. Plus, we'll be looking at the devastating fallout from the fires in Kenya's Tsavo National Park. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be hearing more reacts on the latest UK GDP figures from the chairman of the British African Business Alliance, David Smith. But before then, here's some company news for you. The British multinational retailer Debenhams has confirmed plans to make 2,500 redundancies as part of its latest cost-cutting drive to survive the coronavirus crisis. The latest round of job cuts are part of Debenhams' plans to streamline its shop floor teams and reduce costs as the coronavirus pandemic shows no signs of abating. The retailer added that it has no plans to shut more stores as part of the latest restructure. The British former boss of McDonald's, who was sacked for an affair with a colleague, is being sued by the fast food giant over allegations that he had sexual relationships with 3 more employees. The Chicago company had begun legal action to reclaim the $40 million payoff that is understood to have been made to Steve Easterbrook. The 53-year-old was dismissed as McDonald's chief executive officer in November for exchanging sexual text messages with a colleague in what was said to be a non-physical relationship. Mark Zuckerberg has seen his personal wealth hit $100 billion just 16 years after he co-founded Facebook from his university dorm room. He joins Amazon's Jeff Bezos and Microsoft's Bill Gates in the Century Billionaire Club. The latest boost to Zuckerberg's wealth came after Facebook launched a new short-form video feature called Reels as a rival to Chinese app TikTok. The launch prompted Facebook's shares to jump more than 6%, having risen by almost 30% this year. Zuckerberg owns 13% of Facebook, and the social media platform owns Instagram. Now, more reaction on the UK GDP data that was released earlier this week, showing that in Q2 the British economy shrank by 20.4%. For this, I'm now being joined by David Smith, the chairman of the British African Business Alliance. David Smith, thank you once again for joining me on the show. Your initial thoughts on the 20.4%, pretty startling Q2 GDP contraction.
Exactly the sort of level of contraction that I expected. It was always going to be huge. You can't take that number of people out of work, put them into furlough, and lose their productivity without expecting a serious decline. It sets us all on our mettle, and we do need to find those commercial opportunities that give people work, that develop business for the UK, and allow us to look forward with a little bit more confidence.
You talk about those opportunities, David. I know you've got a large network. Our viewers in Nigeria may not know you, but certainly people across Britain will know you. Are you expecting an increase in urgency from people in the diaspora who are keen and budding entrepreneurs?
I think that there is a there is a hurdle that they face. There is an attitudinal hurdle that says, I don't have the resources to do what I want to do, therefore I can't do anything, therefore I'm stuck. And what I would be imploring them to do is to come out and start talking about what they want to do with other business professionals, and let's see how we can do something about it. Funnily enough, I recently had a call from the Department for Business, Energy and Infrastructure. And their concern was how to reach BAME businesses and to make sure that they're taking up the allocation of funds that are available for them, because that is a problem. And it's a problem to UK PLC if the BAME community are not accessing the funds that allow them to sustain their businesses through this difficult period and to sustain the jobs of the people that they were or ought to be employing. So am I expecting an increase in urgency? No, I'm not expecting. I'd like to stimulate it. I'd like to see people coming forward. It's interesting. Over this period, we've started a new network in Devon. And between the 14th and February and today, we've developed a pipeline of $345 million worth of projects coming out of Devon for Africa. If we could be doing that in every county in the UK, I think we'd be beginning to address some of the issues the economy needs us to do.
In other news now, a wildfire that raged through Kenya's Tsavo West National Park last weekend was finally brought under control earlier this week. Tsavo is one of the biggest national parks in the country, and the fire happened at a time when the government is trying to revive the tourism industry that has taken a hit by the pandemic. One of the observers commentating on the lack of media coverage of the event is Derek Mugisha. He's the founder and CEO of Fika Africa Advocacy Foundation, and he joins me now. Derek Mugisha, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. I've just started seeing some of the devastating pictures from last weekend. Can you please tell me what are the first kind of fallouts from this devastating fire?
Yes, Derek Mugisha, I'm connecting in from Uganda. We saw these fires starting up on Saturday at around 2 p.m. And the Kenya Wildlife Service reported that there were fires happening. But of course, it wasn't really reported that much. And these fires have been happening already. This was the fifth time in 3 months. So that was really alarming, and it needed the much needed attention for it. So really the global community didn't know actually about this because it wasn't much publicized. But again, the fire was contained earlier this week, and reported that there was no animal that was affected. Yeah, but again, we know that small species were affected in this process. So yeah, really, it was really bad, but at least they were trying to contain the fires.
One of the reasons why I knew about this story from here in Britain is because I saw your social media post basically bemoaning about the African media and them not giving this event enough coverage. Do you think that's one of the major issues we have in tackling climate change on Africa? It's just not a priority for media or government.
Actually, why I was addressing media is because when we get to know about the death, maybe the helicopter, maybe one time one of the stars in the night ball field when they died, it was easier for us to know really someone has died. Or even the disaster that really recently happened in one of the countries where they had fires that also happened and destroyed the city. It was easier for us to know about them in less than a second. But then this was a fire happening in an East African country, Kenya, and even the media there, including the journalists that are there, could not cover and tell the world what was really happening. We might have lost even big species in there because these contribute much to the tourism sector, and we all know what that means to for the economy of Kenya. So we would say it's not the priority, but media has a role to play in terms of communicating the solutions, showcasing what is really happening, the dangers and disasters happening, so that maybe those that can take action, maybe contribute funds, donations, maybe to stop the fires could have acted then and then. But of course, Kenya Wildlife Service ruled that no one gave them support. But I spoke to one of our partners, Africa Wildlife Foundation there, that they gave them actually 1.5 million Kenyan shillings. And that was maybe for fuel, for the trucks, maybe to go and stop the fires. But of course, the support came in there that even the army was inside there, giving them support through the aerial reducing of the fires. But yeah, really, I think media has a big role to play in solving African issues. And if that was meant to happen, it would have started by showing us this, at least some challenges, maybe those that can solve them could be able to help us. So it has been an appeal that even media does not air out stories of young climate activists in Africa that are really pushing for climate amendments, policies that are doing solutions. So I really was bitter for the media, but good enough. They came out to report about after 2 days. So imagine if Kenya was burning for 2 days and we knew about it, what would have costed to Africa?
Absolutely. Gosh, well, Derek Mugisha, thinking that you're somebody who is flying the flag and staying active. Derek Mugisha, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.